Welcome back, legends. Before we start, subscribe and share this video right now. Comment below, where are you watching from? And what time is it? Let's explore Scary World. In October 2019, a solo backpacker named David Chien spent 3 nights in the backcountry of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, along a section of trail that sees fewer than a dozen hikers per week outside of peak season. What happened during his second night would fundamentally alter his understanding of the wilderness. He thought he knew. David had secured a permit for backcountry campsite number 47, a primitive site roughly 8 miles from the nearest trailhead. The forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures. He'd made this trip twice before, always in summer, and considered himself experienced enough to handle the solitude of an autumn trek. The trail that day had been unremarkable, the usual steep grades, rocky footing, and spectacular views of valleys beginning their transition into fall colors. He reached the campsite around 4:30 in the afternoon, giving himself plenty of daylight to set up camp and prepare dinner. The site consisted of a small clearing, a fire ring that hadn't been used in some time, and a bare cable strung between 2 trees. There were no other campers within miles. The isolation was exactly what he'd been seeking. As the sun dropped behind the ridgeline, David prepared a simple meal on his camp stove and hung his food bag properly. He'd brought a paperback and a headlamp, planning to read until exhaustion took over. The forest grew quiet as darkness settled in, that peculiar stillness that comes when daytime birds cease. Their calls and nocturnal creatures haven't yet begun their routines. Around 9 p.m., David heard footsteps approaching his campsite. Not the sound of an animal moving through underbrush, but the distinct rhythm of boots on the trail. He called out a greeting, assuming another backpacker was passing through. The footsteps stopped. No response came. After a moment, the footsteps resumed, growing closer. David unzipped his tent and shone his headlamp toward the trail. A park ranger stood at the edge of his campsite, just beyond the reach of his light. David could make out the silhouette of the uniform, the ranger hat, the general build of a man perhaps in his 50s. The ranger didn't speak. He simply stood there, facing the tent. "Everything okay?" David called out. "I've got a permit if you need to see it." The ranger remained silent. David felt the first stirrings of unease. In his experience, rangers were friendly, talkative people who checked permits and offered advice about trail conditions. This silent presence felt wrong. "Do you need something?" David tried again. The ranger turned and walked back toward the trail, his footsteps fading into the darkness. David sat in his tent, headlamp still on, trying to make sense of the encounter. Perhaps the ranger had been at the end of a long day, too tired for small talk. Perhaps he'd simply been doing a visual check of the campsite. David told himself these things, but sleep didn't come easily. At 2:17 a.m., according to his watch, the footsteps returned. The same measured pace, the same approach from the trail. David's heart hammered as he listened. The footsteps entered his campsite and circled his tent. One complete revolution. Then another. The ranger was walking around his tent in slow, deliberate circles. David's hand found his knife, though he couldn't imagine actually using it on a park ranger. He wanted to call out, to demand an explanation, but fear had locked his throat. The circling continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 5 minutes. Then the footsteps moved away, back toward the trail, and disappeared. David didn't sleep the rest of that night. He sat upright in his tent, knife in hand, listening to every sound the forest offered. When dawn finally broke, he packed up his gear with shaking hands and started the hike back to his vehicle. He would not be staying a third night. On the trail out, David encountered a day hiker coming up from the trailhead. He mentioned the strange ranger visit, half expecting the hiker to offer some rational explanation. Instead, the hiker's face went pale. "What did he look like?" The hiker asked. David described what little he'd seen, the silhouette, the uniform, the hat. The hiker pulled out his phone and showed David a photo. It was a memorial page for a park ranger named William Garrett, who had died in 1982. while performing a backcountry rescue in this very section of the park. The photo showed a man in his 50s, wearing the ranger uniform that David had seen the night before. "People see him," the hiker said quietly. "Backpackers, mostly. Always at night. He just walks around the campsites, checking on people. Some folks say he's still doing his job, making sure everyone's safe. Others think there's something else going on." David made it back to his vehicle and drove straight home, 6 hours without stopping. He never returned to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The photo on that memorial page matched exactly what he'd seen in the darkness, down to the particular angle of the ranger hat. And according to park records, no living rangers had been conducting backcountry patrols in that area on the night of David's encounter. The footsteps circling his tent, the silent presence watching from the tree line. Whatever it was, it hadn't been human. Not anymore. In June 2021, 3 college students from Virginia decided to spend a weekend hiking in Shenandoah National Park. Tyler Bowen, Jessica Ramirez, and Kevin Park had been friends since freshman year and wanted one last adventure before graduation scattered them across the country. They chose a moderate loop trail that promised waterfall views and a remote observation point overlooking the valley below. The hike began normally enough. They started early Saturday morning, packs loaded with camping gear and enough food for 2 nights. The trail was well maintained and clearly marked. They passed several day hikers in the first few miles, exchanging pleasantries and trail reports. By early afternoon, they'd left the crowds behind and entered the quieter sections of the park. Their planned campsite was located near the observation point, a rocky outcropping that offered panoramic views of the surrounding mountains. They arrived around 4 p.m., claiming one of 3 established tent pads. The other 2 pads were empty. They had the place to themselves. The observation point itself was breathtaking. A flat expanse of granite extended perhaps 50 feet from the forest edge, ending in a sheer drop of several hundred feet. Safety railings had been installed years ago, but were now rusted and leaning. The view stretched for miles, ridge after ridge of green mountains, a silver thread of river in the valley below, and the hazy blue distance of the Appalachian chain. They set up camp, cooked dinner, and sat on the observation point watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Kevin brought out his camera and took dozens of photos. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared, and by 8 p.m. they'd retreated to the warmth of their sleeping bags. Tyler woke to the sound of voices. He checked his phone, 1:33 a.m., outside the tent. Somewhere near the observation point, people were talking. Multiple voices, though he couldn't make out the words. He unzipped the tent quietly and peered out. 4 figures stood on the observation point, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. They appeared to be having a conversation, their voices low and indistinct. Tyler assumed they were campers from elsewhere on the trail, who'd hiked up to see the stars. It seemed odd to do so at 1:30 in the morning, but people did strange things in the wilderness. He was about to retreat back into his sleeping bag when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The figures were standing beyond the railings, out on a section of rock that had partially collapsed years ago. He knew this because they'd examined that exact spot during the sunset, noting the dangerous gap and the crumbling edge. No one in their right mind would stand there, especially in darkness. Tyler grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the observation point. The figures vanished instantly. Not moved away, not ducked behind rocks. They simply ceased to exist the moment the light hit them. The observation point was empty. He woke Jessica and Kevin, his voice shaking as he explained what he'd seen. They wanted to believe he'd been dreaming, but the fear in his eyes convinced them otherwise. They stayed awake for the next hour, watching the observation point from their tent. Nothing moved. Nothing appeared. At 3:45 a.m., the voices returned. All 3 of them heard it this time. Distinct conversation, multiple speakers, the occasional sound of laughter. Jessica grabbed her phone and started recording audio. The voices continued for approximately 8 minutes, then fell silent. When they played back the recording, it contained nothing but wind and the distant hoot of an owl. None of them slept the rest of that night. When dawn broke, they packed up their gear and examined the observation point in full daylight. The crumbling section was even more dangerous than they'd realized. A fall from that spot would be fatal. There were no footprints in the dust, no signs that anyone had been standing there. They decided to pack up and hike out rather than spend another night. As they loaded their backpacks, Kevin reviewed the photos he'd taken the previous evening. He found something that made his hands start trembling. One photo, taken just after sunset when the sky still held a faint blue glow, showed the observation point clearly. Kevin remembered taking this particular shot. He'd been alone. Tyler and Jessica had already gone back to the tents. The photo showed Kevin's shadow stretching across the granite, cast by the last light of day. It also showed 4 other shadows on the observation point, standing in the exact positions where Tyler would later see the figures. Long shadows, human-shaped, stretching toward the camera. But in the photo, Kevin stood alone. There was no one else on the observation point. They hiked out in record time, barely speaking. At the ranger station, Jessica hesitantly mentioned their experience to the ranger on duty. He listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. When she finished, he pulled out a filing box from beneath his desk. "You're not the first," he said, flipping through incident reports. "We get maybe 3 or 4 reports a year from that observation point. Always the same thing. Voices at night, figures standing where no one should be able to stand, shadows that don't match reality." He showed them a report from 1974 about a hiking club that vanished from that exact campsite. 4 people, experienced hikers, checked in at the ranger station and headed up to the observation point. They never checked out. A search party found their camp intact, tents set up, food still hanging from bare cables, personal belongings untouched. But the hikers themselves were gone. The search continued for 2 weeks with no results. The case remained unsolved. "We can't prove a connection," the ranger said, sliding the reports back into the box. "But I don't camp up there anymore. And I suggest you folks find a different trail next time." Tyler, Jessica, and Kevin drove home that afternoon. The audio recording from Jessica's phone remained silent except for wind and owls. Kevin's photograph clearly showed 5 shadows where only one person stood. And somewhere in Shenandoah National Park, voices still gather at the observation point in the deepest hours of night, standing on crumbling rock where no living person would dare to tread. In September 2018, an experienced hiker named Robert Torres embarked on a 4-day solo trek through the backcountry of New River Gorge National Park. At 53 years old, Robert had been hiking for 3 decades and had completed sections of the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, and countless smaller routes throughout the eastern United States. He knew wilderness protocol, carried appropriate safety gear, and had filed a detailed itinerary with the Park Service. His planned route would take him along a series of interconnected trails through some of the more remote sections of the park. The weather forecast was ideal: clear skies, comfortable temperatures, and no precipitation expected. Robert started his hike on a Thursday morning, planning to return to his vehicle by Sunday afternoon. The first day proceeded exactly as expected. Robert covered 12 miles, reaching his planned campsite by early evening. He set up camp, prepared dinner, and slept soundly. Day 2 began with clear skies and a well-marked trail. Robert maintained a steady pace, stopping occasionally to consult his map and GPS unit. Around 2 p.m. on the second day, Robert noticed another trail running parallel to his own, perhaps 30 yards to his right through the trees. This struck him as odd because his map showed no parallel trail in this section. He stopped and checked his GPS coordinates. He was exactly where he should be on the correct trail. The parallel path visible through the trees shouldn't exist. Robert considered investigating but decided against leaving the marked trail. Perhaps it was an old maintenance road or an unmapped social trail created by hikers, cutting between official routes. He continued hiking, occasionally glancing through the trees at the parallel path. Then he saw the hiker, a figure moving along the parallel trail, matching his pace exactly. Robert couldn't make out many details through the trees, just the general shape of a person with a backpack, hiking in the same direction. He called out a greeting, but the figure didn't respond or acknowledge him. The distance and the forest made conversation difficult, so Robert simply waved. No wave came in return. For the next hour, the parallel hiker maintained perfect pace with Robert. When Robert stopped to drink water, the figure stopped. When Robert resumed hiking, the figure resumed. When Robert increased his speed, so did his silent companion. The behavior was unusual enough to trigger concern. Robert decided to try an experiment. He stopped completely and sat down on a fallen log, pretending to adjust his boot. The figure on the parallel trail stopped as well, standing motionless among the trees. Robert's unease deepened into genuine fear. He stood and resumed hiking, moving faster now. The figure matched his increased pace. Robert began to jog, his pack bouncing uncomfortably. Through the trees he could see his companion jogging as well. The parallel trail seemed to curve closer to his own, the distance between them shrinking. After 20 minutes of rapid hiking, Robert reached a section where the forest opened up, allowing a clear view to his right. The parallel trail was visible, a clear dirt path cutting through the undergrowth. But it was empty. The hiker was gone. Robert stopped, breathing hard, scanning the area. No movement. No sign of anyone. He consulted his map and GPS again. According to every resource he had, there should be no trail where he'd just seen one. He was alone in a section of park that saw minimal traffic. The nearest campsite was still 3 miles ahead. Robert decided to push on and reach the campsite while daylight remained. He hiked quickly, no longer stopping for breaks, desperate to reach a destination and set up camp in a defensible position. The parallel trail did not reappear, and he saw no further sign of the mysterious hiker. He reached the campsite at 6 p.m., with roughly 90 minutes of daylight remaining. The site was empty as expected. Robert set up his tent, hung his food, and prepared a cold dinner, not wanting to waste time with his camp stove. He crawled into his sleeping bag before full darkness fell, exhausted from the rapid pace and the stress of the afternoon. At some point deep in the night, Robert woke to a sound outside his tent. Footsteps. Someone was walking around his campsite. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and close. They circled his tent once, twice, 3 times. Robert lay frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe loudly. The circling continued for several minutes before moving away into the forest. Robert didn't sleep again that night. He lay in his tent, knife in hand, listening to every sound. When dawn finally came, he emerged from his tent to examine the area around his campsite. The ground was soft enough to show footprints clearly. His own prints from the evening before were visible near his tent and at the cooking area. There were also other prints, boot prints larger than his own, circling his tent in a pattern that matched exactly what he'd heard during the night. The prints approached from the forest, circled the tent multiple times, then walked away in a straight line back into the trees. Robert followed the prints for approximately 50 yards until they reached a faint trail, cutting through the underbrush. The same parallel trail he'd seen the day before. Robert made a decision. He would not continue his planned route. He would hike out immediately, using the shortest route back to his vehicle. He packed up camp in record time and started hiking by 6:30 a.m., using his GPS to navigate the most direct path out of the backcountry. As he hiked, he kept looking to his right, scanning for any sign of the parallel trail. It appeared and disappeared throughout the morning, sometimes visible through the trees, sometimes absent. He never saw another hiker. He never heard voices or footsteps, but the sense of being watched, of being accompanied, never left him. Robert reached his vehicle by early afternoon, hours ahead of his planned exit time. He drove directly to the ranger station and filed a report about his experience, the parallel trail, the matching hiker, the footprints around his tent. The ranger listened carefully, took notes, but offered no explanation. I've heard stories about a parallel trail in that section. The ranger finally said, "Never seen it myself, but we get maybe 1 or 2 reports a year. People see trails that shouldn't exist, or they see other hikers who vanish when they get close. We've searched those areas. There's no unmapped trail. There's no maintenance road. Whatever people are seeing, it's not on any of our maps." Robert asked if anyone had ever followed the parallel trail to see where it led. The ranger's expression darkened. "3 people that I know of. 2 came back and said the trail just faded away into nothing after a few hundred yards. The 3rd person never came back at all. We found his campsite, his gear, everything. But he was gone. Search went on for 3 weeks. Never found a trace. Robert left the park that afternoon and has never returned. He still hikes, but only on popular trails with heavy traffic. The image of that figure matching his pace through the trees, the sound of footsteps circling his tent in darkness, and the sight of boot prints leading back to a trail that shouldn't exist have left permanent marks on his understanding of wilderness. Somewhere in New River Gorge National Park, a parallel trail still appears and disappears among the trees. And somewhere along that trail, something still walks, pacing hikers who venture too deep into the backcountry, following them through the forest, circling their tents when darkness falls. Park rangers have no explanation. Maps show nothing, but the reports continue year after year from hikers who encounter the trail that exists in a space between the known and the impossible.